The Washington, Adams, Jefferson administration, politics, alphabets, and aliens. That's on the docket for today. Let's talk about that. So in our last class, we had been talking a lot about events that have been happening out in the West, like the Louisiana Purchase and Lewis and Clark and the War of 1812 and the Western Confederacy. This time, we're actually going to take a step back in time, and we are going to look at the politics and the events that are happening in the East. And we're also going to take a brief snippet of time into a lot of the presidential actions and things that happen along with that. So our two essential questions we're looking at today are, one, will the United States always have two political parties? This is kind of a fun thing to speculate, especially in our recent election where we've had not only political parties be challenged, but then they're also starting to morph in some really cool and interesting ways that probably deserves some more discussion. And then number two, how does politics affect society and people? As you'll find here, the decisions made by presidents and people that aren't president, like Alexander Hamilton, has a really big influence on society. So we're going to begin with the one, the only, Mr. Washington. Now, Washington was our first president and the only one that was 100% elected unanimously, and meaning he didn't have a single vote against him. Now, this is in 1786, so just 3 years after the Revolution is finished. Washington's administration is pretty straightforward. A lot of his Federalist policies are put into place. Washington is a kind of quasi-Federalist. So, for example, Hamilton, as his Secretary of the Treasury, begins implementing things that we'd talked about before and we'd heard in the play Hamilton, such as consolidating the national debt and getting in the national bank. What I didn't tell you guys is that the event that we had, that random event that we had last class when you guys were designing or building a country, actually happened. During Washington's administration in 1794, this would have been in his second term, something called the Whiskey Rebellion broke out. And this is a really important event that happens for Washington and really for the whole nation. So when this rebellion breaks out, it occurs because of Hamilton's taxes that he's put into place, and farmers in this one area in Pennsylvania decide that they've really had enough. Now, what eventually ends up happening is Washington comes along, raises about 12,000 troops, and puts the rebellion down hard. And there's a couple reasons why this is significant. One, obviously, as the nation's president, people are looking to him for leadership, but then two, Washington is looking here to really solidify the power of the national government over individual, even, states, cities, and areas, to make sure that the federal government is in charge. So Washington not only does, a broad swath of leadership things that probably deserve more time than we have here, but there is one act that probably deserves some attention, and that's the Judiciary Act of 1789. This act, it's kind of something we take for granted, but actually is really important. So what this does is state court cases can be appealed to the Supreme Court, and whatever the Supreme Court decides, that's what becomes the law of the land. Now, again, we kind of take this for granted nowadays, but there's actually no part of this in the Constitution. So this act being passed by the Federalists is not only another example of how the national government is greater than the state government, but it's a really important example about how our Constitution actually begins practically working. So in terms of overseas events, Washington's kind of foreign policy can be really summed up by one word, and that's neutrality. Washington really tries to keep the very baby, very precious United States out of foreign wars in order to make sure that it survives. So, for example, like when the French Revolution starts, just after the American Revolution, Washington sits back and watches France burn and does not help and does not offer any assistance, even though they had agreed and had signed a treaty with the French king at that time, who was now dead when the French Revolution started, that they would come and assist them. But Washington is very determined not to put the United States at risk. Besides this, Britain also at this time, besides all of the problems in France, Britain had also begun its policy of impressment that would eventually, in about 20 years, lead to the War of 1812. Now again, Washington is committed to neutrality, so he, in this one instance, signs or sends over his delegate, a guy by the name of John Jay. and Jay signs a treaty with the British, and really it breaks down like this. So the Americans agree that for British properties that were confiscated during the American Revolution, if there was debt included with those, that they would pay those off. And in exchange, the British promise that they will remove themselves from the Northwest Territory. The problem, though, is that they don't. And if you recall from the last lesson, we talked about the War of 1812 and the Western Confederacy and the idea that, and the fact that they were supplied by the British. The fact that the British don't leave the Northwest Territory is kind of a big deal 25 years down the road. So Washington, by the year 1796, has served 2 terms in office. And he decides to set the precedent that when 2 terms comes along, he's done. And many presidents, in fact, almost all of them, follow him in this practice afterwards. So when 1796 rolls around, there's 2 members of Washington cabinet that run against each other. One is John Adams, and the other is Thomas Jefferson. Now, by this time, Jefferson is definitely the head of the Democratic Republican Party. The interesting thing, though, is that Adams wins the election, but Jefferson becomes vice president, because at this time, there wasn't the constitutional amendment yet that, you could bring in your own vice president who was from your own party. The loser in the election became the vice president. So kind of an awkward situation, and Jefferson's actually absent from a lot of it. But Adams really goes on to continue a lot of the policies that Washington put in place. The one exception to this, though, is the XYZ affair, which brings us to the alphabet part I mentioned at the introduction. So France, along with Britain, had begun impressing ships and supplies by this time. And what Adams decided to do, because he's trying to continue on in the policy of Washington, is he wants to basically keep, America from getting involved in a war it doesn't need to. So he sends over a delegate. This delegate arrives in France, but he doesn't get to the French ambassador. Instead, he's confronted by these 3 agents, and they get nicknamed X, Y, and Z, and that's how they're known back in the States. And this is a huge scandal that erupts, because what the agents do is, instead of allowing him to go and see the ambassador, these 3 agents basically say, well, we'll stop impressing American ships, but you're going to have to pay us a bunch of money. So it's basically extortion. And in their attempt to get a bribe, the French not only look awful, but they really anger not only the Federalists, but a lot of Americans generally. So what the U.S. does in response, it cuts off all trade with France, and then it also starts impressing French ships in retaliation. So the Federalist policy of cutting off all trade to France obviously makes our other party, who does favor France, the Democratic Republicans, really upset. And they begin to dissent and write newspaper articles and really protest against the treatment that the Federalists are giving them. The Federalists, though, decide to take a pretty radical action. They basically say, we've had enough of being talked bad about in the press by the Democratic Republicans. So what they do is they implement 3 laws, and you'll definitely want to know these 3. The first is the Naturalization Act. So what they do immediately is they change the time that you can become a citizen from you have to stay in the country from 5 years to now it is then 14 years it takes for you to become a citizen, which is a pretty dramatic change. And the reason why they do this is because the second act, the Alien Act, basically allowed the Federalists to deport anybody that could be a foreigner, or they could assign them to be a foreigner. So for example, like if a Democratic Republican was a newspaper editor, they could accuse him of being a foreigner and they could deport him out of the country, and he's just gone. The third act was probably the most controversial, and that's the Sedition Act. Now, even though we have today a pretty strong and vibrant press and First Amendment type, kind of culture built into the United States, the Sedition Act kind of flies in the face of that. So what it was is it said Democratic Republicans cannot, or anybody really for that matter, cannot publish insults or attacks against the president or members of Congress. Now, this is clearly like a big free speech issue, but what the Democratic Republicans basically have happened to them because of this is all those people who are protesting against what the Federalists were doing to France and how they felt about, the XYZ affair, all of a sudden they find themselves very much locked up. And many dozens of newspaper editors and people who were fighting against the Federalists find themselves not only out of a job, but in prison. So in terms of a response, Jefferson and Madison, who are now the head of the Democratic Republican Party, sponsored 2 resolutions. They're very similar, almost identical, and they're called the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, and they were published in those states. The thing, though, is that Jefferson actually ghost wrote these resolutions, and that's because if he would have put his name on it, he could have possibly been imprisoned for writing something, that was considered to be at that time really treasonous against either the president or Congress. So what the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions argued for is they basically said this as a logical appeal. Well, the federal government, all it is, the only reason it exists is because a bunch of states have come together and have given it this power to pass laws. So with these new acts, if states oppose them and a state doesn't think it's correct, then the law shouldn't be put in place. It's kind of like the whole is not as great as the sum of its parts. This has a lot of ramifications in the future. First of all, it will be turned around, and I think quite probably rightfully so, that Jefferson probably came up with an early use of the idea of nullification. That a state, just because it doesn't like the laws of the federal government, can say, no, we're not going to follow that. Now, this is a big, national power versus states power issue. But for Jefferson and Madison back then, this wasn't necessarily what it would turn into later, where it was like, no, we're not going to agree to what the federal government says against slavery. For them, it was something much, much deeper about free speech and protest. So again, the idea is that Jefferson and Madison are basically saying the federal government is only there because states have come together and made this thing, and if the states think that the law is a bad thing, then the law shouldn't exist. Now, along with these resolutions, and generally the whole American populace really hated the Federalists for putting in the Alien and Sedition Acts and the Naturalization Acts. So what happens is by the time 1800 rolls around, this is again after the first term of President John Adams, there's an election. But something happens in this election, and that'll bring us to the cliffhanger for the end of this lesson. There's a 3-way tie between Thomas Jefferson with 73 electoral votes, John Adams with 65 electoral votes, and Aaron Burr with 73 electoral votes. You might recognize Mr. Burr, as he is the guy who will eventually kill Hamilton. So go ahead and predict for me. We had never had this happen before in the United States in 1800. So just go ahead and guess if you don't know. What happens in the case of a tie when 2 people are tied for the most number of votes in the Electoral College? There actually is a method for this, but just take a guess. And I'll give you a hint. It's not a 3-way game of rock, paper, scissors. I'll see you guys next time.